What you'll hear on Patreon.
How well this kind of ideas work. I mean, you have from UNICEF, yeah, again, let's say from Madagascar, you have then these findings, like I cannot say the exact numbers, but let's say 70% of young children are victims of violence by the hands of their own family members, of the parents. So you have like, I mean, you have two things here. You have the children and you have the parents, right? So this sounds so good because you it shows an opportunity to rescue, to save children. So you focus on that. And that's why it is so difficult. So when you criticize it, then you immediately presented as somebody who is not really for, protecting children. But you could also turn it around. You could say this kind of narrative of suffering children allows to vilify parents all over the world in such an extreme way and based on such a thin and problematic knowledge base, which would be completely unimaginable when children would not be involved. I would say, when you simply say 90% of adults in in country X are like criminal and violent. So you couldn't say that. But when you add, then when you put the focus on the child, on the children, on child protection, um, then you can say it. My name is Gabriel Scheidecker. Currently, I'm based at the University of Zurich. I'm here at the Department of Social Anthropology. Yeah, I just moved here 1 month ago, the beginning of July this year, to start a new project on early childhood development interventions. So I guess the topic we are going to talk about today. I'm an anthropologist. For my PhD, I did research, ethnographic research on child development, emotion socialization in Madagascar, in a rural community of Madagascar. Um, so I spent there roughly 15 months. And so this was for my PhD. And after that, I turned to research in Germany, in Berlin, with families with a Vietnamese migration history. And here I also focus in particular on the experience, the interaction between these families and the welfare system, like especially practitioners of parenting support. So these are my two research foci. So my current research, as I mentioned in the beginning, will then focus on early childhood interventions around the globe. And here I focus in particular, my own work really aims to create like debates between different fields involved. On the one hand, early childhood development science, and on the other hand, ethnographic research, because according to my experience, these fields are largely isolated. So this is what I'm currently working on.
Well, you're singing my song because I originally came across your work and just reading the abstract of a paper.
Poor brain development in the Global South, challenging the science of early childhood interventions by Gabriel Scheidecker and co-authors, 2023, Ethos, Journal of the Society for Psychological Anthropology. Global Early Childhood Development, or ECD, an applied field with the aim to improve the brain structure and function of future generations in the Global South, has moved to the center of international development. Global ECD rests heavily on evidence claims about widespread cognitive, social, and emotional deficits in the Global South, and the benefits of changing parenting practices in order to optimize early childhood development. We challenge these claims.
And it made me sort of cheer out loud because it was exactly what I had been sort of arguing and saying and thinking, but in a different context and said much better than I ever could,
Thank
which is that how could people not see that arguing that poverty is caused by you get poor cognitive development is a rehashing of centuries old, very racist discourse, but through, three layers of thick fawning social justice rhetoric. And I wondered, could you tell me a little bit about that paper? So what is global early childhood development?
Okay, I mean, first of all, I should mention maybe that I'm not coming from this field myself. As I said before, I'm coming from anthropology. So I'm actually, yeah, working on this field, about this field, with this field. And yeah, just started a few years ago. So I'm also not a complete expert. But I mean, um, in my work with about parenting intervention, parenting support, I came across this field and started to be really interested in it because I found that the scientific claims or the claims in general are so much different from what we usually point out in anthropology about child development. And in fact, it was really shocking to see that, as you also just pointed out, to really um, explain social inequality by mental capacities. Yeah, so it is, I would say it is an emerging field of international development and humanitarian aid. It emerged, I would say, in the 1990s, through several studies, for example, in Jamaica. And but it really, I think, it is really now that we are experiencing the global implementation of early childhood development interventions. So and I should also add that this is a field which is strongly promoted by all major organizations in the field of international development, like UNICEF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and also NGOs like Save the Children and many others. Um, and it, yeah, in 2018, the Nurturing Care framework has been launched. So this is a framework for the global implementation of early childhood development. It has been accepted by the World Health Assembly in 2018 as well. So it is really the official program. Um, and this may be important to know that as a background. And now concerning the ideas of this field. So I think the fundamental idea is that um, poverty is really reproduced by poor early childhood development. Um, of course, not only, but the idea is that this is a major factor for reproducing or perpetuating poverty. So the idea is that in what is framed as poor or the context of poverty, children in early childhood are not fostered optimally. So the child rearing practices do not really foster optimal early childhood development. They mostly refer to cognitive development, but also to socio-emotional development. And then that this suboptimal early childhood development would lead to poor school achievement in middle childhood and then low adult productivity in adulthood. And um, and then this would lead to a next generation of poorly developed individuals. And in this way, so this idea of the intergenerational transmission of poverty would then perpetuate the situation. And now the idea is to change this cycle or to break through early childhood development interventions. Um, I would say that most of these interventions focus actually on parents, on mothers, aiming to change their parenting practices, their behavior, according to a set of best parenting practices, or what are believed to be best parenting practices. And then this would like enhance early brain development, and then lead to higher school achievement and higher adult productivity. So turn around this dynamic. So this is the basic idea. And most importantly, I think that these ideas are presented as based on scientific evidence.
There's a lot in what you just said that I want to come back to, particularly this idea of mothers. And you hear this all the time and you just sort of passively accept it because it's wrapped up often in the rhetoric of like women in the global south are the future.
We're not talking about population control. What I'm talking about is giving women the power to save their lives, to save their children's lives, and to give their families the best possible future.
So it sounds really feminist. But what they mean is we need to intervene to make them better mothers, to stop them having so many children. This sort of thing is often what they mean by women are the future. And also that you can't give any money to men because they're not trustworthy, this kind of thing. But I was wondering, now it's probably not enough for me to just state, oh my gosh, I can't believe this rhetoric is coming back. Because actually it's also coming back. It's there on the left, or things that sound kind of leftish. It sounds very social justicey and so on. It's hidden in the spawning language, and often it uses a language of decolonization as well, which is strange. Not strange at all, actually, if you think about it. But it's also coming back on the right. So you see people kind of reacting to what they perceive as a left-wing rejection of science in favor of constructionism and so on. Everything is social constructed. And so they've started sort of rehashing old race science, IQ, this sort of thing. They're saying, so what? I'm just going to say it. White people are smarter, this kind of thing is coming back. So maybe it does need to be explained. Why is the science here not convincing? I think this is the big pushback that I often get too. It's like, oh, Ashley, you just ignore the science. So what's wrong with the so-called science that is supposed to underpin this stuff?
Okay. First of all, I want to say I'm not like trying to criticize science in general. My aim is really to improve the knowledge base of such interventions. And in my view, the main problem is that this field, global early childhood development interventions, operates in the global south, but has really little evidence on the context in which they operate. Most of the research, or let's say the basic research, which defines normal in quotation mark, childhood development, best parenting practices, and so on. Most of that research has been conducted in Western middle classes, in fact, in the US and a little bit in the UK. So one could say most of it has been conducted in maybe Anglophone Western middle class settings. And then these findings are then simply like projected to the rest of the world. Of course, they have also applied research in these settings, like randomized controlled trials. But this kind of research is most of the time applied, and it relies heavily on all the standards and normative frameworks which have been developed in one context. Maybe I could give you an example also from my research. So when it comes to, and I also should say most of the evidence is really indirect. So for example, the idea that the majority of young children in countries of the global south do not receive adequate early stimulation, what is believed to be crucial for brain development or cognitive development. So they have these questionnaires which simply ask like mothers or parents something like, have you played with your child in the last so and so days? And then they say no, for example, and then they derive from these data, okay, these children do not receive any early childhood stimulation. But now we know from anthropological research about children, from cross-cultural research, cross-cultural psychology, from cultural psychology, from many other fields, that children in many contexts grow up with many more people than just the parents. And for example, in Madagascar, where I did my PhD research, as I mentioned in the beginning, I really focused on the social network of children and found that children in this context most of the time play with other children. And in fact, it is true that they rarely play with adults because adults don't see themselves as play partners of children. But that does not at all mean that children rarely play. They play the whole day. And so this simple fact of like what has been called multiple caregiving or distributed care is ignored. And then you come to the finding uh, these children do not receive early childhood stimulation because their parents do not play with them. So it is based on a simple projection of a nuclear family model we have most of the time in Western middle classes to other contexts where this model doesn't fit. So and so this would be an example of a rather indirect like evidence. I mean, it's not only the problem then of early stimulation, how they measure it, but then also deriving from this observation, then like that the brain doesn't develop properly or something like that. So there are so many gaps, I would say, and potential biases, which are not really attended to in my view.
For me, this all seems really, really obvious. And I don't know if it's because I come from a peculiar background or because I come from an anthropology background. But when I read these critiques, it's so blindingly obvious that this is an error, that you cannot project Western middle class parenting norms onto the rest of the world as an ideal and then measure up the rest of the world and say, oh, wow, everybody is not raising their kids properly. But, it surprises me when I'm teaching, when I tell the students that in the anthropological record, parents playing with children, and especially like mothers playing with children, is very rare. The last thing a mother wants is for her child to see her as a playmate. When you've got tons of things to do, you don't want your child to see you as a playmate. They go play with the other children. And they're shocked to hear this because they have been learning all this time that how important it is to play with your children, to say this many words to your children, and blah, blah, blah. And we've got the science to prove it. And yet the majority of humanity doesn't raise their children like that. But I wondered, could they really be making such a mistake? I mean, it seems so obvious. I mean, do they really not at all account for these things? Like, how do cultural norms figure into these reports or analyses, if at all?
I mean, for me, it is really difficult and maybe also not the most important thing to figure out what are the intentions behind those scientists, whether they believe in what they are claiming or not. But I mean, to a certain extent, I can believe that they believe in what they're saying. I mean, it is also. First of all, I would say that parenting practices are extremely morally charged. Um, um, I think there are a few other things which you find so important and which is also when you see different practices where it is so difficult not to respond with a moral judgment, let's say. I can say this also like from my own experience when beginning my research in Madagascar, when I saw like really different practices, or when I saw like what may look like disinterested parents or something like this. So I think there can be an immediate, if you have never seen like something else really than let's say Western middle class parenting. So you can easily have this impulse of thinking, oh, these poor children, they're really not well taken care of, and so on. And I mean, as anthropologists, and I think also as sociologists, or yeah, as scholars from other like disciplines which have more of an exploratory approach, you have the chance to like get over this initial tendency maybe to judge and really try to understand why is it why is it different than what you would expect. And but these are all my imaginations. I mean, when I imagine now a scientist coming, let's say, from pediatrics, because many of the scientists involved in global ECD, they are pediatrics. I don't think they have the time to really spend, let's say, with families in a different context to really learn what the views are and the reasons and so on. And also, it is really, I think, in this scientific background, it is much more applied from the beginning in the medical field, of course. So I think you also learn already in when studying, you learn to differentiate what is healthy, what is unhealthy, more or less in this binary logic. So this would be my spontaneous take on it. But as I said in the beginning, yeah, I also don't want to be too quick to judge them on a personal level.
I mean,
Maybe if we would have started from this medical field as a pediatrician, maybe I would also tend to do the same. And I think, as you also said in the beginning, many of these things sound really good at the first glance. I mean, what should be bad about supporting children to get, the best development possible, or to have the to experience well-being and so on and so forth.
it's just really amazing to me that scientists can produce these kinds of estimates and not think like, gee, I might have made a mistake here. Because, for instance, in another paper, you point out an estimated 250 million or 43% of children under 5 years in low and middle income countries are regarded as at risk of not achieving their full developmental potential because of inadequate care. That is crazy. Like almost half of the children. And like, I can just imagine them being like banging their fists on a table. That is an injustice, and we demand adequate care we need to support parents. I can well imagine how they would frame that. And they would not think like, that's way too high a number. And then you get to the more absurd estimates, like 99.5% of Chad. 99.5% of the children in Chad. Do you think maybe there's something wrong with the way that you're estimating? And can you give a little bit of context to that 99.5% estimate for Chad? How did they produce a number like that? The 99.5% of the children in Chad are at risk of not reaching their developmental potential.
Yeah. So this is a study we criticized, and this study is based mainly on the multiple indicator cluster survey of UNICEF. So this is a large scale survey that is, I think, is conducted in almost every country with a sample which is supposed to be representative. So this is really a big. I mean, this is a survey where really a lot of money and a lot of funds are needed to conduct these surveys with thousands of participants in every country of the globe. So and now I mentioned that earlier. So they have particular questions to screen like potential problems in the way children are taken care of. And So what we were focusing in our critical commentary about was early stimulation or early learning, opportunities for early learning, what I just I also described with the example of Madagascar. So for early learning, they used like 2 questions. I cannot reproduce them like word by word. So the first question is basically, does the child attend an organized childhood program? So something, I guess, like a kindergarten or things like that, an early childhood program. And the second question was, does the child have a book or toy at home? And if one question was responded to negatively, so let's say the child had a book and a toy at home, but did not attend an organized childhood program, then it was categorized as minimally adequate care or minimally adequate early stimulation in that case. If both were absent, so if the child had neither a toy or a book at home and did not attend a program, then it was categorized as not even minimally adequate early stimulation. And yeah, I guess that in Chad, for example, 99.5 of the parents responded with no, we don't have that. And yeah, so I, I think I repeat a little bit the points I already told before. I think it is really easy to see how these 2 questions exclude all other potential forms of early learning. And I can explain that a little bit again with my research in Madagascar. It is true that these children do not have a book at home and toys at home. No, actually, nobody in that community has a book at home, and they also don't have these toys. I mean, the question then is also, of course, how to define the toy, how to define the home. Here, in this context, children play the whole day with all kinds of things, which they find in the real world around them in the village. So these children, I mean, they don't even spend much time in the home. They just sleep there, and the whole day they explore the environment, and they are able to freely do that. So to completely ignore this fact, that there are so many other ways of early learning is, in my view, I mean, for me, this is really a case where I wonder, okay, this should be so obvious and so easy to see that there are other ways. And also with a early childhood program, I mean, who says that children can only learn if they attend something like a kindergarten? This is like, I mean, even let's say in Germany, the kindergartens, I'm not saying that kindergartens are bad at all, but I'm just saying that there are also other ways children can learn. So maybe coming back to your question about the intention behind it, or like what I would blame the science for. So I would not blame them that there are bad intentions behind or something like that. I think they're really, I assume most of the time, really good intentions
In fact,
behind.
that's part of the problem, because then it means that they're less likely to stop and think, like, am
But
I the bad guy?
what is my criticism, that these scientists do not look for other evidence and for potentially contradicting evidence, but that they just look for the evidence which supports these preconceived ideas about deficit early childhood development in these contexts. Because these studies, I mean, I just referred to my own research in Madagascar, but there are thousands of other studies which one could look in. And especially if one organizes interventions or creates evidence about countries and contexts where which are completely foreign to the researcher. So why not look into the existing ethnographic research on these contexts before?
Do they not sort of nod to it? Because as I say, as I keep saying, it just seems so obvious that there are just other ways of educating children in different cultures. Surely they must sort of nod to this, or is it just literally when they produce these papers, they talk about the injustice of it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it is really the question: who designed these multiple indicator cluster surveys and this question, and who checked if these questions are really, if there's really, if these are really externally valid? Because, as you say, it is you don't need to be an anthropologist or sociologist of childhood to see that these questions are simply derived from like a model which does not maybe even exist in Western context. And it is so obvious that when you project this model or this idealized model to another context, that you always find deficits. You cannot find anything else than deficits, unless this community happens to work exactly the same as I don't know, Western middle class context. But I should also add that it is not only a problem of these sciences. I think it is also partly a problem of my own science or my own discipline, let's say, or related disciplines like anthropology, sociology, and so on. I mean, we tend to be always critical about research in neighboring disciplines, especially in medical disciplines or disciplines that use rather quantitative approaches. But I wonder, why have we been so unsuccessful to really make sure that our criticism reaches those we are criticizing? Um, I mean, in anthropology, we talk so much about decolonization and all these issues, but at the same time, we do nothing if there's like a new field emerging, which you could really frame as a severe form of neocolonialism, as you said in the beginning, which is based on assumptions and claims which are not much different from those assumptions and claims on which historical colonization was based on. So my question is also, as an anthropologist, why have we failed to really reach those we are criticizing, and how can we do that better in the future? And I think my main answer why we have failed is that we really tend to share our criticism with our colleagues from the same discipline. This does not necessarily happen intentionally. We publish it in anthropological journals. We use a specific terminology. We draw on taken for granted concepts and positions and so on. And then, of course, it is highly likely that our colleagues will read it, that they will also agree to it. And it is highly unlikely that those we are pretending, so to say, to criticize, that they will simply ignore it or not even take notice of it.
I think also a related question is, why is there so little critique? So when it came to Indigenous people and research on Indigenous people, I went to a conference 10 years ago, and immediately I was looking around and I was like, oh my God, this is incredibly insulting. And yet there were Indigenous people there, clapping and oh, this is great. And everybody was like, oh, it's so important to improve the well-being of Indigenous people and improve the lack of mental health support is a travesty. The government needs, and it was very much in the language of social justice and so on. But you had to think like, well, what is the underlying explanatory framework for social problems on reserves if the travesty is that the government doesn't give enough mental health support? It's that we have cognitive deficits. That's what they were saying. They were saying that through the legacy of colonialism, we have we have deficits in how we raise our children because we would never learn to be mothers. My mother's white, first of all, so how does that explain anything that goes wrong in my life? But like, not everybody went to residential school. There were only of that generation in my family, only like I think 2 or 3 out of 7 or 9 children. I can't remember. There's lots of children, but lots of them died in infancy. Only like 2 or 3 of them went to residential schools. Like, how does that explain any kind of problems that we have? Right. But just because this overarching explanatory framework through these deficits, but I could find 3 or 4 people who are really criticizing this intergenerational trauma idea. It's just, nobody, no, not only does nobody question it, but it gets framed as decolonization. And if you're like a good person in the social sciences, you should be banging on about decolonization, decolonize this, which just means like better representation for Indigenous people in the existing social hierarchy, but not really questioning the fundamental basis of why there is that inequality. Like, some reserves don't even have drinking water, but we're supposed to like have, through healing, somehow, some way, we're going to solve all these problems. To me, it sounds really ludicrous. So I guess the question is, why is there so little critique? What is it that seems to draw so many people in the social sciences to actually joining that crusade rather than questioning it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, yeah, for me, I mean, as a like white Western person, I mean, I cannot, give really a lot of explanations why, let's say, as you mentioned, in indigenous communities in the US or so, there's so little critique. I mean, I can maybe give some like more general ideas about the question. So why is this explanatory framework so attractive? I think first of all, it is attractive to all elites, whether they come from the West, but or they come from let's say a country like Madagascar or Vietnam. I mention also Vietnam because I have also done some research there and planning research there. So this idea is attractive to elites because first of all, it tells, okay, these problems have nothing to do with my own privilege. These people are poor; they suffer because, yeah, in this case, because of the way they raise their children, and so all we have to do is, I don't have to change anything with myself. I can simply help them in healing, in getting better, and so on. And I think so. Yeah, on the one hand, you can see the problem in the poor. So on the other hand, you can see yourself as somebody who helps, and this is also a kind of help which is rather easy. So you just organize these behavior change interventions, and you can think already, okay, I have done something good and achieved something. And let's take the example of Vietnam. But I think we could also take any most other countries. So there, these early childhood interventions focus really mainly on minorities in Vietnam, and of course for the government, for the elite. This is a very good idea. Okay, these minorities, they suffer and so on because of child rearing. They do not suffer because they have been marginalized, and so on and so forth. And I think this is also what really adds a problematic dimension to these frameworks, because they provide a rationale or justification to settings all around the world to not aim to not really aim to change anything on a structural level, but to simply basically blame those people for their for their own situation. So this is maybe one reason why so many also. So I think it doesn't really depend whether you're a Westerner or not, or whether you belong to this specific culture, but it more. I think it more relates to whether you have whether you are more privileged or less privileged in the situation. Because I mean, as I said before, I don't know about these people who in indigenous community who like applaud to it, but I would guess that most of the time, people who appreciate it, they don't see it as really their own problem. They wouldn't say that, okay, I'm doing it also wrong, but they would say, okay, the others are doing it wrong. Yeah, so this is maybe one explanation. Another explanation is, I think, that for researchers and practitioners, these international organizations offer all kinds of opportunities. My colleague Nandita Chaudhry often mentions or has told that, for example, in the context of India, UNICEF pays so much more than most other organizations. So there are really strong incentives to work. I mean, it's so attractive to work for these organizations. And of course, when you work for these organizations, you also need to somehow buy into these ideas. And I think the same goes for researchers and scientists. I mean, they also often depend on funding from countries from the global north. But this is also now again, I think, a problem a little bit of anthropology and our science. We should not forget. I mean, these sciences, ECD sciences, they do studies in these countries in collaboration with local institutes and researchers and so on. So they provide this kind of funding, but in return, I would say they receive how can I say that? In return, there's a strong incentive for the local researchers to also to repeat these ideas and to support these ideas, or in the other to see it the other way around, to avoid criticizing those people which provide the funding and which provide the opportunities to participate in these large scale studies, and to maybe then be co-author of a publication in a high impact journal. So I see these two reasons basically for these tendencies. And then of course, it is also maybe a third one could be like culturally. I mean, the elites in the countries around the world. I mean, they belong, I think, also to a common culture, which is really close to this Western middle class culture, and which also affects child rearing. So they may also be convinced that this specific way of dyadic child rearing, parent-child interactions, having eye contact, having these lengthy conversations, playing with the child, smiling, and so on, that these are the best things for child development.
I think part of reason too why there is an attraction to some of these initiatives is that, as you said, like there's funding involved, right? So if you can promise, like, I'm going to do this intervention, it's going to have this outcome, then it's much easier to get funding, as opposed to sort of like this sort of lengthy exploratory research, which can be quite expensive as well. And you can't promise in the end what you're going to find. But I think too, like there's also an incentive to jump on board of things that sound so good. And increasingly it's become personally risky to question some of these things that just sound really good, these crusades. So one of the things that I've had a lot of flack about is that I've been really against the idea that governments should outlaw corporal punishment, which UNICEF is actually a big player in that if you look at the entire world, the vast majority of cultures use some form of corporal punishment, and they're very careful about how it's sort of embedded in the culture. Some will have like third-party discipline, this kind of thing. But it exists everywhere. And the idea that you should throw parents in jail all around the world, by the way, because it's a global crusade, and they actually go to poorer countries first, where there's a democratic deficit.
Standpoint Magazine, 2019, by Ashley Frawley. Campaigners claim more than 50 countries have banned smacking as evidence of a turning tide. But let's look at this list. Togo banned smacking in 2007. Why would a populace facing serious poverty and high child mortality demand a smacking ban? The answer is that they did not. The Togolese law appears connected to an IMF World Bank poverty reduction program involving a suite of policy guidance, including a UNICEF-supported children's code banning corporal punishment. Such crises abroad often represent opportunities to institute unpopular policies whose existence becomes a goad for policy change at home, but a worldwide awakening to the goodness of positive parenting, this is not.
But when they were getting an IMF sort of bailout, one of the conditions was for UNICEF to write their children's code, and they outlawed corporal punishment. And luckily, it's not going to be enforced in countries where, they're dealing with childhood AIDS. But they use that as a goad then. Oh, look at all these countries around the world waking up to the right way to raise children. You England, you Wales, you Scotland, you United States, you need to do this too. And questioning that has got me so much flack, where I just thought it would be just so much easier just to not say anything, And I wonder if you had anything to say about that.
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.